Welcome to the Alaskaland podcast, stories from the Fairbanks North Star Boroughs past, present, and future, with your host, Mayor Bryce Ward. Each episode, we'll sit down with Fairbanks' most interesting characters for a fascinating conversation about where we've been and where we're going. And now, Mayor Ward.
Hey everyone, we're here at Pioneer Park, and we've got a special guest today. We have Justin Karella with Just Originals. Justin, it's nice to meet you.
Thanks.
Maybe introduce yourself for everyone that's listening.
Well, I've been working my business here as a carver and a sculptor here at the park for 21 years now. Over at the Harry Karsten cabin, he's the first man to have climbed Denali and the first man to actually have managed what used to be Mount McKinley National Park.
Wow, that's amazing. And where are you at in the park? Let's talk about that for folks that.
Well, right across from the old train station and the hotel, the
Pioneer Museum.
The Pioneer Museum, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, got a big giant dog sits in front of my shop every day. You can't miss me.
Can't miss it. So if you've been here, you know.
Yeah, everybody knows the dog. Hardly anybody remembers me, but they all remember my dog.
So this is an amazing studio. I'm
Thanks.
not sure if that's what you would call it.
Well, it's a little gallery right now. My studio, actually, where I do my work, it's just that what I do is just too dusty and too messy. So here's where I show the work and tell my stories. And we had homesteaded out on the Stees Highway, and I built a cabin up on the top of the homestead property, and that's where my studio is.
So, and this is amazing. So you've got all your artwork is original. I think we just mentioned that.
Yeah,
at
just
the
one of a
beginning.
kind.
Just original.
Yeah, that's it. That's the name.
That's the name, right? That's great. So you've got. Let's talk a little bit about your history. You said you've got a homestead.
Yeah, my
grew up
dad
here?
came up here in 48 after the war. He was 18 in 1945. And I think when he came home, going back to Nebraska, was just so small. Those boys hadn't seen anything before the war, and then they'd seen everything after the war. And when he was a kid, he used to read Jack London books, Call of the Wild and White Fang, and he never forgot those books. And he had a new wife, and they were working just as waiters and anything they could get at like the national parks and whatnot. And one day he just looked at his wife, Betty, and he said, let's just go to Alaska. They had just opened the highway in 48. I believe that was the first year they opened it. Mm-hmm. And so toward the end of that, they just threw everything they owned in the back of a Jeep and drove over the Elcan. When it was actually really something to say, you drove over the Elcan.
When you needed a Jeep.
Yeah. But, and they were on a lark. They were kids. And they decided just to tell all their friends that they went to Alaska, just to say they'd gone to Alaska. And then they were here for a while for the summer, and they enjoyed the summer in Fairbanks. And they said, well, let's just stay the winter. So we can tell all our friends we stayed the winter in Alaska. And they bought an old Army 10-man tent. And they ended up living for 3 years in that 10-man tent.
Oh, my goodness. Yep. And is this on the same homestead that you...
No. The homestead came later.
Okay.
This before Fairbanks was Fairbanks. I mean, before it was a city. It was not the city of Fairbanks. So when they came here, it was a township. And they had lots that they built that were right across from the old market basket. And which was kind of a pain to the city because we still could have pigs and chickens and whatnot when the whole rest of the city, they didn't like us much there. Everybody, the whole community liked us, but the planners didn't like us because we had like a little farm in the middle of the town. But we had grandfather rights, so they couldn't kick us out.
So that's kind of your childhood then,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, we had a feed and livestock business, Karella's Corner. Anybody that's been around for a while knows Karella's Corner.
That's great. And you have a bit of history with the park too as part of
Yeah,
your
we used to,
childhood.
we came in, we sold our ducks and geese and whatnot to the park, and they fed them all year long, and then we took them home in the fall. It was kind of good for a homestead family.
Yeah,
they
no
paid
kidding.
to feed them and fatten them up, and we took them home in the fall.
So they still do that now, although I don't think that it's the same arrangement for the ducks.
I have no idea what it is. We've been out of the feed and livestock business since the 80s, the early 80s.
Gotcha. And you've been doing carving since about that time?
No. I started carving when I was about 12. I was illiterate. I couldn't read or write. I was considered retarded when I was a kid. I was classified literally as unteachable.
Oh, wow.
They put me in classes with Down syndrome kids and any kid that they didn't know what to do with. Nobody really knew anything about dyslexia back then. At least it wasn't common. I just couldn't read or write, and they just assumed I was unable to learn. And I had a sister that I love stories, though. That's a lot of my carvings tell stories, and I tell stories all day long about my life and other things. Stories got me through the times. She started reading me this book, and I had never known that you could fall in love with characters in a book like you fall in love with people you know. Mm-hmm. And one day she quit reading it to me, and when I brought her the book, I said, "When are you going to read the book again?" She was a teenager, and so she said, "You read it." She knew I couldn't read. But it was kind of like this weird challenge. I knew if she wasn't going to, I had to learn what happened to those people in that book. So it took me about 5 years, but I taught myself from scratch to read and write from The Hobbit.
Really?
That was the book.
That's amazing.
And as I began to learn more and more about reading, the worlds just began to open up in my mind, and I literally sometimes felt like my hands were on fire. I didn't understand what it was. But it turned out I saw an old movie called Shane. And in the end of the movie, the guy whittles this little pistol and gives it to the boy before he rides off into the sunset. And I just thought that was kind of magic. He just took a stick that most of us just throw in the fire and made something that kid will keep for the rest of his life. I wanted to be that guy. That was like a magician to me. It was you take something simple and make it magic. And I wanted that magic. And nobody would teach me. So I taught myself, just like I taught myself to read. I sat there and just took a piece of wood off the wood pile and started carving, sculpting in clay, anything. We were homesteaders, so we didn't have a whole ton of money, and there was 10 kids born in our family, so there wasn't a lot. They finally forbade me from carving the soap anymore because the sisters, I knew I didn't waste the scraps. I didn't waste. They squished it back together, but my sisters got tired of washing with squished together soap bars.
Yeah.
So they forbade me from carving the soap anymore. But I carved and sculpted anything I get my hands on. I didn't really tell anybody about it because most people, when I was going to school, only knew me for knocking heads together. Mm-hmm. Nobody even imagined that I was an artist, or myself. I never called myself an artist till I was well into my 20s. To me, being an artist was something magical.
Where you were able to take a concept, an idea, and then kind of breathe it into something.
I never thought of it that way. It's just my brain would make pictures and stories, and my hands would do it. I never understood the concept of where the twain mate. It was just I knew I desperately wanted to tell stories, and it turned out my hands. Before I was a good speaker, my hands told the best stories. And so whatever story was going on in my head, my hands would tell it. And I actually got a scholarship to college for theater and fight choreography. So I became actually a fairly good actor and et cetera. And I developed the other part, the storytelling, verbally later. But my first storytelling was in clay and anything I could carve and sculpt. And those were my first stories.
And they continue on here in your shop.
Yeah, now I do a little bit of drawing, carving, sculpting. Pretty much I'm a little bit the same. It's really eclectic. I carve in really a lot of different mediums and whatnot, just simply because that's when I grew up. You couldn't afford to buy anything, so you just did with what you could find. Like I carved a Bowie knife from a stick I pulled out of the wood pile. That was there, and it was cheap. It was free, you know. My first carving knife, toenail clippers?
Yeah.
The real fancy ones have a little knife with a curved top on it?
Yeah.
That was my first carving knife. I found an old pair of, I'm serious, an old pair of toenail clippers, and that was my very first carving knife. I did more carving on my hands than I did on the material, but the very first success I had was I carved a shark. Of course, it was Jaws then had come out, and the shark looked like a shark, like a real shark. The only problem is I kept cutting myself and bleeding on the shark, and then I have to spend more time scraping off the blood stains. But that darn shark was cool.
Do you still have it, or is it?
Well, I was afraid you were going to ask that. No, one of my brothers thought it was very cool too, and then one day it wasn't there.
Oh no!
And when I went back to ask him where it was, he goes, "Well, I don't know. What am I supposed to do? I put it on the shelf." I knew he took it. And I'm pretty sure he gave it to his girlfriend, and I'm pretty sure he told her it was his. But the weird part about that was I thought if my oldest brother thinks something I did was cool enough to steal and give away or keep, then maybe I actually can do that. I know it's kind of a weird backwards way of looking at it, But it was a weird compliment, even though he stole it from me. He still to this day has never admitted it. But I'm pretty sure.
Pretty sure.
But what it did is it actually made me think that somebody that was that much older than me thinks that something is cool enough that they wanted to have it. In a strange way, it did actually push me forward to think maybe I can carve, maybe I can sculpt. So it was kind of cool.
And so you just started doing it more as like a hobby then, and then when did it turn into a business like you're doing now?
Well, I sold things periodically, but mostly I gave stuff away because when I traveled a lot, I took jobs that were that I traveled a lot in. I was a timberman, I was a sword fisherman, I was a bouncer, like everybody. I've had a lot of different jobs.
Apparently a jouster?
Oh, yeah. I toured from LA to New York with a professional jousting team. And I ran my own company for about 3 years. So about 4.5 years all told, I was a professional jouster.
And that's a conversation starter, I'm sure, right? So what's on your resume?
Well, that's one reason I put some pictures up there. When I'm telling stories about my life, it seems kind of ridiculous. So I had to start putting proof that my stories are actually real stories. They're not just, make believe. But no, I used to break horses when I was a kid with my little brother. Well, we rebroke them. We take horses that people couldn't ride anymore, and we'd buy them cheap and then re-break them and then sell them. Mm-hmm. And my main study, when I was a senior in high school, a friend of mine and I, we won all the acting competitions, statewide, everything. And it happened to be a scene from Taming of the Shrew. It's a Shakespeare play where the man and the woman actually have a battle scene where she basically beats the heck out of him throughout the entire scene. And we saw it on Broadway, or a video of it, and we just copied everything they did. And one of the judges from the final competition we won, his master's was in theater and fight choreography, and he was the dean of his theater. So they sent me a letter, and so from a kid from freshman in high school, I was considered retarded, to I was on the honor roll, and I got a scholarship for theater and fight choreography at my senior year in high school.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a run.
Yeah, and it's so amazing that you taught yourself to read, and the desire to know more about the characters and to push yourself in that way.
I didn't. It was nothing noble. I just couldn't stand the idea of not knowing what happened to these people.
Yeah.
If anybody would have actually spelled out the challenge of teaching myself to read, I would never have believed I could do it. It was just a sheer desperation. And the way I taught myself is completely backwards. And it turns out later with my artistic eyes, I looked at the letters not as letters, but as a picture of a word. Mm-hmm. And I would just make up everything I couldn't figure out. I just make up in between the words that I could. So the story continued. And in 5 years, I got 5 complete different versions of it. But every one was wonderful. When I first auditioned for the college, I had to do a theater audition. And this is the guy that gave me the scholarship, and I'm terrified that they're going to find out they made a mistake. And I went down and I did the audition, and I panicked. And I went back to when I was a kid, teaching myself to read. I'd catch a word, and then I'd panic, and I'd lose. And so I just started talking, and I'd made up everything in between. I'd find another word that I recognized, and then I'd panic again. And so it's called a cold audition. And I got done with it. I'm in flop sweat, and I know they are going to take my scholarship away, and they're going to say, "Sorry, kid, we made a really big mistake." And of course, 3 seats from me was the guy that gave me the scholarship, and he's the dean. And I sat down next to him, and he goes, "Justin," I thought, okay, here it comes. They're going to send me home. And he said, "That was very good. It was nothing like what was on the page, but it was very good." And I realized that and they never once ever again said a word about it. They understood I had a disability, a reading disability, but they'd seen me act, they'd seen me compete, and I won everything that I competed with. So they just backed off, and they knew that I just got to look at the world a slightly different way. As long as I can, sieve it through my own mind, then I'll figure it out. And it's usually pretty good when I'm done. And that's the way it worked.
Well, I would say, if you look at anything that you have in your shop here, it's amazing. It really is.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
So
it's a labor of love. Even today, I was afraid when I first started doing it for a living that it would become a living. You know, a lot of people hate what they do or they just get tired of it. And that's why I decided to do just originals. I'd never fall into the trap of doing the same thing over and over again to make a little bit extra money. I want each piece to be magical.
Yeah.
And I still do to this day. It's magic.
That's great. Well, Justin, thank you for taking some time to share with us today. We're here in your shop at Pioneer Park. If folks want to come down and see you, what are your hours?
I'm usually, the park is open from noon to 8, and I'm usually here between 11 and 7.
11 and 7. Okay. Well, come on down, check it out, and see Just Originals. And like you said, every
my
piece,
big spotted dog
and the dog, every piece is original. So, Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure to get to know you a little bit, and encourage everyone to come down and say hi to you. And just, do you have any parting words for any of the folks listening? Anything that you would say?
If you haven't been to Pioneer Park, it's actually pretty fun. A lot of people go, there's more here than I thought there was, and I was born here. So yeah, if you haven't been around, just even if you don't grab up the kids, come down. There's some really good food. There's some of the people cooking food. We've got American and Greek and all kinds of great foods. And there's a great ice cream shop too.
There is. That's one of my kids' favorites.
On a sunny day, come on down and just enjoy the afternoon. And come see us. We'll enjoy your company.
That's great. Thanks, Justin.
Right.
Fairbanks, oh Fairbanks.
Thanks for listening to the Alaskaland podcast. We hope you found today's conversation enlightening. For more episodes, listen on your mobile device through your favorite podcast app or watch at youtube.com/Fairbanks North Star Borough.
Above the adventure soul that live and breathe the Alaskan dream, our heritage.